Hello, my name's Luke Bennett. I'm really sorry that I can't be here with you today for what looks like a really interesting set of events. I'm very grateful to the organisers for allowing me to attend in this rather disembodied way. And I hope it doesn't detract too much from the substance of my presentation that I'm delivering it in this pre-recorded version. I'd be delighted to receive any feedback or questions, criticism, whatever, after this presentation, sort of through the email address that you see on the screen. That would be wonderful. This presentation very much reflects my area of work, which somewhat straddles between two worlds and tries to make a virtue out of that straddling. By professional background, I'm a lawyer, having spent a number of years advising people on the dangers of letting members of the public anywhere near their industrial or other land holdings. And since moving across into academia, both in terms of my teaching and in terms of my research, I've been pursuing the question almost as a self-interrogation of why was it that my colleagues and my clients were so obsessed with keeping people out of their premises? How did we reach that conclusion? How did we sustain that conclusion and circulate that conclusion amongst ourselves? And what were the motivations in contrary terms? What were the motivations of those who really did want to get onto those sites? What were their motives? What were their methods? What were their reasonings? So bringing those two worlds together is what I'm about. Most of my work nowadays doesn't get published in legal journals. It actually gets published in geography journals. And I'm going to keep the technical legal element of the presentation today to a bare minimum in appreciation of you as an audience and also the actual needs of this topic. So here we go. I'm going to try and persuade you that the gap between the worlds of embracing the landscape sublime and reconciling that to the worlds of risk management and legal analysis are not so far apart as convention or instinct might suggest that they would be. And I actually think that there's quite a lot going on within law as it's applied to site management that actually starts to look quite similar to what we might call the landscape sublime. And I'm going to explain what I mean by the landscape sublime as we go through this presentation. So those are the the presentation is going to be comprised of three sections. In the first section, I'm going to think about how big the gap is between the way in which law and risk management read the world and the sublime actually reads the same places. Throw in a few provocative linkage points on that topic. Then I'm going to think about another aspect of the sublime, that the sublime is concerned with things beyond representation, beyond words, beyond understanding, and again think about whether the gap is quite as big as we might assume it to be. And then in the final parts, I am going to try and reconcile matters of landscape language back into the sublime from the point of view of this theme of safety that's going to run through my presentation. So we start off with that question, how close to the edge? And to make my points, I'm going to introduce a small number of case studies of sites that have some connection to sublime landscape type projects. So I'm going to start with a grade 1 listed landscape, Hawkstone Park in Shropshire, which is made up of some rugged clifftop paths and some follies, faux ruins constructed on the estate in the latter part of the 18th century. This landscape that was augmented by those follies and by the delineation of those paths upon the rugged surface of this rock outcrop was described by Samuel Johnson in 1774 in the following terms. Very much symptomatic of the grip hold, if you like, of the sublime as a way of reading landscape in the latter part of the 18th century. So, by the extent of its prospects, the awfulness of its shades, the horrors of its precipices, the verdure of its hollows, and the loftiness of its rocks, the ideas which this sight forces upon the mind are the sublime, the dreadful, and the vast. Above is inescapable altitude, below is horrible profundity. So there's the sublime as a measure of landscape, if you like, as a landscape aesthetics, alive, loud and proud in 1774. It's the outcrop as it stands today, and if the instinctive reaction to that image is one of aversion, in the sense that there are handrails there, and isn't that a sort of sacrilege to the idea of congress with edges that the sublime might be seeking to encourage, that those railings may have been put in place by some horrible health and safety functionaries who are getting in the way of the full writ and remit of an aesthetic embrace of landscape and its potentialities. If all of that is your instinctive reaction to that scene, then I have made the right assumption about your reaction. If it's not, then bear with me. So I'm going to take it as an assumption for the purposes of working through my argument that the site there of railings seems somehow inauthentic to this clifftop experience. But here's the but. Here we go with another late 18th century set of commentators. We've got Caspar David Friedrich just nudging into the 19th century there with the iconic Wanderer above the sea of fog. I suspect you'll see that image from others in other presentations later on during this conference. But anyway, there he is, contemplating the natural sublime, the landscape sublime, in other words, through his gaze. And his gaze is constructed on certain aesthetic rules, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau puts it in his autobiographical work Confessions, describing a walk that he took and the mode of seeing that he engaged in as a matter of course as part of that walk. I must have torrents, fir trees, black woods, mountains to climb or descend, and rugged roads with precipices on either side to alarm me. That's what he's looking for out there in his search for the sublime landscape. And a great part of my amusement in these steep rocks is that they cause me a giddiness, a swimming in my head, which I am particularly fond of. So he's hoping to be dazzled, dazed, awestruck, overwhelmed by the landscape sublime. But there's the caveat. He wants all of that, but he wants to be safe too. It's coming in a number of ways within Rousseau's account of his wandering aesthetic sensibility. He refers elsewhere to the road having been bordered with a parapet to prevent accidents. So he doesn't slag off health and safety functionaries, he congratulates them for having put some parapets into place in order to enable him to contemplate the bottom and make myself giddy at my ease. So the parapet is facilitating his sublime engagement with nature. Goes on. Leaning firmly on the parapet, I advanced my head and remained there for hours, looking at the froth and the roaring blue water and the finest cavalcade of birds I have ever seen. Firmly on the parapet. The parapet is enabling that congress. Moving across to Edmund Burke, obviously slightly earlier than Rousseau, very influential. So the sublime is a regulated terror. Maybe regulated is not the right word, but it's terror of a certain amount and degree. As he puts it, terror is a passion which always produces delight when it does not press too close, i.e. when there's a parapet in the way. So I think there's this latent safety requirement, enabling safety requirement within the landscape sublime, as the Romantics at least composed it towards the end of the 18th century. So for all the talk of the sort of terror of the scenery, as Johnson was putting it in that description I read out earlier, these safety provisions were implicit to the late 18th century conceptualization of how you go about engaging with the landscape sublime. The operators of Hawkstone Park, operating it in the early 21st century as a tourist attraction, as a heritage landscape, very much knit into Samuel Johnson's sublime riven description and depiction of this landscape. And you can see there very similar stylistics to what we encountered with the Johnson paragraph. So there's talk there of a pitch dark labyrinth, ancient mines cut into the cliff, a bridge, a rustic wooden structure, perched over an unnervingly deep chasm, a path wending between two cliffs which narrows into a dark, creepy tunnel. Sublime indeed. But for anyone running, operating a place of this type, there is a balance to be struck. The terror, as it were, has to be safely simulated and controlled in order for it to be accurately and appropriately delivering the sublime. Marsh, writing from a site owner's and operator's point of view, doesn't talk about the sublime, but clearly in terms of having this intrinsic notion of what the countryside experience for a visitor entails, and talking of this need to balance an impression of unrestrained freedom to commune with nature against the reality of tight legal and corporate parameters is indeed a balancing act that has to be seamlessly pulled off. So, from both the legal, corporate and sublime point of view, You must be close to the edge, but not too close. So moving on to item number 2, describing the indescribable. Look at another feature attributed to the romantic sublime, the landscape sublime, that it is concerned with experience of the phenomenon of landscape at the point of its moving beyond comprehension. So the very limits of comprehensibility is what is being witnessed within any sublime encounter. It's the point at which words fail, at which points of comparison disappear because perhaps of the vastness of the thing that is being gazed upon. That is the moment at which the sublime comes to the surface, and the repertoire of the sublime is reached for in order to attempt to describe the undescribable. Law, on the other hand, doesn't like things that are undescribable and doesn't like the world to be unknowable, and is very keen to render the world and all phenomenon within it into the medium of language. And indeed, in our rational age, where we are fixated on notions of cause and effect, blame and responsibility, any event or any space, any area must be, this is Law's imperative, must be knowable, measurable, understandable, predictable in terms of its mechanics. As Rowe says, chance does not exist in a just world. So any incident or accident will be investigated, and a mechanical interpretation of who's done what to whom will be imposed upon the world in order to make sense of anything that's happened. The expression act of God is sometimes bandied around, but it doesn't really have much purchase in law these days. There are very few accidents or incidents that are held up to be truly nobody's responsibility because of some sublime intervening inexplicable causal factor. But despite Law's insistence upon having a name for everything and seeking to order every event into a nice explicable chain of responsibility, Law's claim to omniscience, its claim to be able to see and to name and to order everything around it, is a pretense. It's a pretense which embodies an abstraction, and the law is there trying to lay down rules and framings for everything simultaneously and nothing specifically. Law therefore always ends up being distant from the thing to which it is actually being applied, and it will always, as a consequence, be uncertain as regards its local application and implementation. There's always a lot of grey area left, always a lot of scope for debate, always a lot of scope for slippage. And if we look at this provision, piece of legislation which is very much concerned with telling landowners what they will be blamed for if there is some kind of an accident suffered by a visitor who's on their site seeking some kind of a sublime encounter, it's actually pretty generic. So you see the word reasonable in there twice. It's saying you've got to try reasonably hard to achieve reasonable safety of people coming onto your site, which leaves two great big reasonables to be debated as to what is required in any particular circumstance, what degree of effort is required, what degree of safety attainment is required. All the more complex in this circumstance because we are dealing with a matter, public access to the countryside, which has both a positive and a negative face. Many, both culturally and in sort of terms of health, would say that there is a benefit in going out into the countryside, exposing yourself to the elements in a way that doesn't actively bring on bodily peril, but actually getting out and about is not risk-free, but it has benefits in terms of health, psychological, and so forth factors. Now, given that, and given a wide sort of social and cultural embrace of that as a indisputable logic, that it's good to go out and see cows and green fields and what have you, and to gaze at picturesque vistas, it's not surprising that thinking complicates this notion of, but there must also be safety in these places, and how the balance is set between the obligation being imposed upon owners to provide for safety versus the facilitating, the permitting of people to engage in risky behaviours, bodily risky behaviours out there in the countryside. The courts have agonised about off and on in recent decades. That agonising reached its high point in a House of Lords case in 2003, in which discourses of things like human rights were coming to the fore, saying it's a human right to be able to get out into the countryside and enjoy variety and quality of the landscape that's existing in this country. It's part of our liberties, and it's not something that the law should interfere with, and that for people to try and bring compensation claims that would possibly lead to site owners withdrawing sites from access under the fear of having to pay out compensation if something did go wrong, etc. That is not an eventuality that the courts at all want to set. So the court's been quite keen to drop in some indicators, some analogies as to quite what is and isn't required to dispel some myths, perhaps. So it's not required that all trees be chopped down simply because somebody could climb a tree and hurt themselves. It's not a requirement that coastline and other beauty spots must be lined with warning notices simply because someone could do something foolhardy at those locations. So the law's been trying to send out the signal that it values the importance of congress carried out within certain bounds of safety and good conduct out there in the country. So in response to that, people who own sites at which people might want to go and commune with nature have had to think through, okay, so what does this tell us? What does this require of us? To think through what can we assume about particular areas of countryside. Countryside clearly is not a homogeneous thing. Terrains differ. And so in weighing up how hard they must intervene to provide for the safety of persons who might come to their sites, they see it as a spectrum first in terms of, well, how wild and rugged is this place versus how controlled is it already, and therefore should be maintained as such. Also to look at the degree of sophistication of the visitors. Will they be able to provide for their own safety? Are they sophisticated enough to understand the risks that they are bringing upon themselves in their chosen behaviour at a particular location? And also to look over, if you like, sideways at what others are doing and think, well, okay, what's the best practice that similar sites are already doing, and we therefore need to get in line with. All of those lines of thinking lead to, or in theory, lead to the revelation of what is reasonable or what is not reasonable. Safety. So that's very much a discursive process of thinking through, applying the general to the specific and working out what makes sense on the ground. And that brings us really to the third and final part of this presentation, which is to think about how we can draw together the threads here to reconcile language, landscape, and this notion of safety embedded within the sublime. Landscape, of course, is often used as an expression to describe a physical thing, but really it's a way of seeing. It's a construction of perception, a way of looking at space and seeing in it certain forms and ways of presenting and arranging. Likewise, as I think I hope I've indicated to you, both risk assessment and also legal analysis are ways of trying to interpret events that have already occurred or which might occur in the future. And then the sublime is about trying to access a place in order to, from a position of safety, experience certain culturally framed notions of awe, wonder, and limits of comprehension. And I think all three of these have some sort of structural similarities, and they are all ways of seeing. So in this remaining section, I'm looking intertwined. So back at Hawkstone, we have the dilemma for the owners. Their landscape is composed and framed by the landscape sublime ideas of the late 18th century, interacted with by notions of prudent property governance as imposed by law, and also this need to validate what they're doing as a tourist attraction and make it attractive to people and make it inclusive in terms of the ability to move around within the city. For all of those reasons, we see language returning to or being applied to this site, language as a technology in order to understand what might occur at this place as part of its interpretation and provisioning. And that interpretation and provisioning becomes an amalgam. Some of it is safety driven and liability driven, the emergency phone there, the easy access route. Some of it is aesthetically driven, the names of these places, the stylistics of how the map is drawn up. And then we see the awful precipice being in part an echo of Samuel Johnson's depiction of this as a sublime landscape, perhaps in part also as a warning of there's a big drop here. You could hurt yourself if you're not careful at this edge. So I think these things wound in together, not neatly separate. So I think what we're seeing in each of those framings, the sublime, the law/risk, and the conventional sort of landscape aesthetics, is a form of collective landscaping, creating of place through the application of certain concepts, and those concepts are carried through language, imposed upon space, forming and interpreting the experience of enabling it to be rendered as known, and this is true both of the sort of the framing rules of the sublime as well as them being true of the framing rules of law and risk assessment. And also giving a pointer, each and every one of them giving a pointer as to how these places should be provisioned and managed. So owners need to understand how activities upon them will be inspired by certain ideas. Sublime. So, for example, Bell and Lyle talk about the move towards an accelerated sublime, which is found within thrill tourism in the era of tombstoning, base jumping, parkour, planking, and even, fashion for extreme selfies. Landowners have to realize that the sublime is no longer just about the view, it's about the person within the view and the person being in motion, diving, jumping, running, getting to extreme points from which to take the photographs, whatever. The sublime has become dynamic, it's become accelerated, it's become about movement and speed, not just standing and looking. That poses extra challenges. Just to round off, move us away from cliff tops, to think about calmer spaces and how we need to understand, even for calmer spaces, how people are going to mobilize certain notions of proper engagement in those spaces, because those have to be. So this is the Diana Memorial Fountain in Hyde Park, aspiring to be a sublime place at which thought is carried up into the limits of contemplation. With water and no words required. This is all about atmosphere and effect. But necessarily control how people are going to interact with these spaces. They won't necessarily use them as sublime spaces. Is Catherine Gustafson, the designer of the Diana Memorial Fountain. When it first opened, 5,000 people an hour came to see this supposed to be tranquil space. How could they anticipate that? There was no precedent. The absence of precedent, the absence of an ability to anticipate something, is actually more depictive of the sublime than it is supposed to be depictive of the law. But anyway, there we are. I think the two things do connect at this point. They were confronted with something that they could not have, they say, foreseen, something that was beyond comprehension. So they got bitten, if you like, by that form. Sublime, shocked at the inexplicable range of ways in which people would choose to engage with this space, and just emphasizing that dynamism and evolving pattern with which people make and remake landscapes through their perception of them and their engagement with them. So I hope that's been of interest, and as I say, any comments would be very welcome. Just drop me an email, that would be great. But I see that I've just gone over my allotted time, so I'll sign off now and wish you all a very enjoyable conference. And once again, I'm really sorry I can't be with you. Thank you.